That is a yes. Fantastic. Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us today. This is our session on budgeting for equity. We presented earlier this year as part of ICMA's summit on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this might be a very updated version of the presentation we gave probably just 6 months ago. And primarily the reason why is because we've spent the last year working with the Bloomberg Philanthropy Results for America program on city budgeting for equity and recovery. And just my last meeting was the final summary presentation from that cohort of 28 cities. And I'll be sharing some of our lessons learned from that experience, as well as some of our budgeting for equity experiences prior to the Bloomberg efforts overall. Just as a look ahead, next week, December 7th, I know that some of the advertisement for this session was on ICMA's website. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew next week we're going to cover a much broader scope of transforming the budget process, what ICMA calls 21st century budgeting. That's Tuesday, December 7th, and registration is definitely still open on ICMA's website. And what you were going to learn about today will fit into the larger picture next week. But next week is focused on getting to a program level, aligning resources with the outcomes that you're striving to achieve, what it takes from a skill set perspective to be able to have some agility for resource reallocation towards results like climate action, sustainability, equity, and all the other things that we're trying to fund in our future. So very much looking forward to that session. And I'll try to flag along the way today where we have some intersection into next week's presentation. But today, as I mentioned, is really a dive into some of the practical takeaways that we have been learning through our implementation of budgeting for equity initiatives in the What Works Cities Results for America Bloomberg program over the last year. As I just mentioned, we just got off the webinar, which concluded that program, which started just about 1 year ago for many of the cities and their mayors. And it was just an absolutely remarkable experience overall. Much of the research has been published, and there are more stories to come. If you go and just search city budgeting for equity and recovery, you will see some of the articles that I'm demonstrating on the left-hand side of my screen right now. What Works Cities has tried to summarize a lot of the takeaways from individual organizations and make sure that they're available for everybody to learn from. In the top right, we've also been working very closely with GFOA on their efforts in bringing an equity lens into the budget process itself. And then bottom right, of course, we continue to publish blogs on our own website at resourcex.net, also sharing these stories as well. So it's one of the most important initiatives that we are focused on as a company for the clients who we are working with in the priority-based budgeting space. Many organizations are trying to increase equity in their communities, and it is in some ways a new field. In other ways, it's another priority that we need to ensure that we have the resources to fund, and that's really where we come into the picture. We had heard someone describe us recently at the ICMA conference that we're solving the problem behind the problem, which is to say, what you'll hear in this presentation is not necessarily how to create an equity and disparity report and gather the data on inequity in your community, but instead we're trusting that you have those types of resources to really focus on where are the gaps in your community that you're trying to address. But the problem behind the problem is, hey, if we don't get resources made available to commit to our equity endeavors, we can't get off the starting blocks. And that's what's so imperative to us, is that whatever your equity initiatives end up being, that you actually have legitimate funding to pursue them and prioritize those initiatives overall. Otherwise, we're going to fall flat. So the good news is we've been really focused on this for at least the last 2 years. And we have some promising stories and takeaways from the front lines overall. So for our session today, we're going to focus on basically 3 practical problems that we're trying to solve that we think are really important for success in budgeting for equity. The first and probably most surprising to us, maybe not surprising to you, is that we actually have to start our work a little bit earlier in the whole creation of where do budget development requests come from, and how can we begin to help working with departments to create better budget development requests. So that's a very interesting problem to try to tackle, but it's in the actual creation and formulation of requests coming from the departments overall, and what we can do about that to improve it. Second, we're going to get into how to make sure that we're getting really clear criteria for what it means to advance equity in your community overall. Again, kind of seems like a no-brainer, but it's actually kind of tricky. And the clearer that we can get on the definition, our ways to measure it and scrutinize whether or not a proposal is in line with that definition, the better off we're going to be. And then third, last but not least, which is another area that we've been working on for quite some time, but the realization that unless departments feel like there are resources available to fund their initiatives that are in line with your equity result, departments won't feel like it's a genuine exercise, or they might feel like there's some sort of negative trade-off, that they're developing proposals in line with your mayor or elected officials' equity objective at the expense of something else. And to the extent that we can eliminate that perspective and make departments feel like, hey, we have the resources to pursue our equity objectives in addition to other things that you're hoping to accomplish, the better off that we're going to be. So another way to think about it, these are 2 of the most important questions that we're focused on. How can we help departments to produce way better, more compelling budget proposals in line with equity? And how can we encourage departments to submit these budget proposals that are in line with what you're trying to achieve, even if their initial perception might be these are at the expense of some other priority that they're trying to address. So these are the perspectives from our organizations and the front lines as we've seen it over the last year. If this is resonating with you, we sure hope so. These certainly aren't the only problems to be solving as you're approaching a budgeting for equity solution, but we strongly believe that if you can tackle these problems, you're going to be well on your way to something that's successful and meaningful in terms of committing resources towards equity. Where I wanted to get started, this is one of the participants in, Corbett, you might know Ben. He's in Seattle, Washington, budget director. He was participating in the What Works Cities program overall. And as he was describing budget proposals that come from departments, his quote that has stuck with us, he said, "We get what we get. The budget requests, they are what they are. We wish they were better." And it was such an interesting observation for any of us who have worked in the budget office or worked in the manager's office. As budget proposals come from departments, so often you hope that you've set up your environment. You've been clear about the results that are a high priority. You've been clear about your financial circumstances, and then you send out your budget memo and say, departments, the opportunity is open. Please submit your budget requests. And then it's kind of a wait and see. And that, I think, was Ben's overall point, is we're not in control of what the departments are proposing. And our take on it is we kind of wish that we were. We kind of wish that we were advising that process to make sure that that awesome, compelling budget proposals are being created. That if the worst of your problems was you had so many amazing budget proposals and then you have to prioritize through them to pick the best of the best, that's the problem that you want to have, as opposed to, hey, we get what we get. The budget proposals come in and they're not necessarily in line specifically with what we're trying to accomplish. So as we start off our little journey here for today's presentation, this is the beginning of our discussion. So how are we going to go after better budget development requests? I'm going to cover 2 points. The first one in blue there is we've learned something very interesting about why sometimes budget requests come in and they're not exactly on target. And our clue, our little window into the puzzle, is that budget requests based on line item decision units, what if departments are starting with line item data, they're actually, the departments are set up to provide budget requests that are line item based. And it's a non-intuitive exercise. And where we're beginning to find a lot of success is if we can recenter those budget development requests from a program or service perspective, it's actually opening up a much better budget development requests. So that's exactly where I want to start. So what am I trying to describe here? What you're looking at on the screen is more traditional. If this is your organization, you do line item budgeting. I mean, we all do line item budgeting, of course, in some way, shape, or form. Some of us do line item budgeting in addition to overlaying programs or talking about performance and using other criteria in your evaluation process overall. But at the heart of it, all of us do line item budgeting. For some organizations, this is our starting place. If I'm a department and I'm starting my budget process overall for 2022, I start to scrutinize all of my line items. And then my objective is to send you a delta, a change from some starting position based on analysis or trends or whatever my needs are. And if these are my characters or decision units to change, it's actually non-intuitive to look at any one of these and consider how I'm going to advance equity by changing a particular line item. Even if you started from the top, cleaning supplies and materials, if that is my focus and my brain has to think through, how should I ask for more money? Should I ask for less money for cleaning supplies and materials in my department in order to advance equity for our residents and our community? It's a weird starting place. That's what we found. And so therefore, it's of little wonder that departments struggle coming up with awesome budget proposals if this is our starting place overall, these line items. You go down the list, if I'm looking at office supplies or fixtures, again, I'm starting to think through, what can I do to change my office supply line item that makes it more in line or less in alignment with our overall definition of equity? On the right-hand side, I'm showing you a picture of some recent work in the city of Roanoke, Virginia, where they have transitioned from line item data to program data, and programs are the basis for their change recommendations. And all budget recommendations that are taking place right now, this is actual work that we're right in the middle of with Roanoke, they are programmatic change recommendations that have a line item impact, but we're really talking about every program from the departments in alignment with changing the disparities that they are experiencing overall in Roanoke. And this is where we're starting to make a heck of a lot more progress. Let me share a specific story to hopefully bring this point to light. From our work in the city and county of Denver, this is exactly where I was getting some of that initial line item data from. This is exactly what they were experiencing. Their mayor's office has set forth a very clear definition of equity, where your life outcomes and your potential in the city and county of Denver is not predetermined by your race or ethnicity. and they established their very first chief equity officer and office of diversity, equity, inclusion. And yet, as budget requests are coming in, kind of the same experience as Ben Noble, there just seems to be a disconnect. It's, you know it when you are looking at those budget proposals that something is just not quite right. And so in our experience working with the departments in the city and county of Denver, what we were finding is that most of their budget requests were taking place at the line item level. I need more cleaning supplies. I need more office supplies. And then there was like a stretch case being made to tie those budget requests towards the equity definition. And that's where things are starting to fall apart. Like if we could point to one thing, it was centering budget requests at the line item level is leading to the disconnect in their process overall. What it means to get to a program level is recognizing that all of these line items and people in that department are part of a program, or many programs. In this case, the snow removal program overall. Programs open up a superior window to begin to express ideas or come up with new ideas overall to advance equity. So in Denver's case, when we talk about snow removal, and some of you have heard the story before, Denver had done an analysis to understand where vehicle ownership is actually low throughout the city. And for those people who do not have their own personal vehicles, they depend on public transportation to get to their place of employment or to get to City Hall. To walk from their homes to the bus stop means they're using sidewalks, residential sidewalks. And when it snows and those sidewalks become iced over, that's where the barrier exists. They can't get from their home to access public transportation, and it puts them in jeopardy of losing their jobs or losing economic opportunity overall. So the budget recommendation was at the program level to take snow removal of the program and say, hey, we can have a significant impact on equity and economic opportunity if we provide a higher level of service than what we normally do for snow removal by plowing those residential sidewalks, which Denver does not do for the rest of the city. It is a specific increased service level recommendation that certainly costs more money and impacts their line items at the fleet level and at the supply level and at the personnel level. But see what they did. They didn't start at office supplies or cleaning supplies. They started at snow removal, and here's something they could do that really does have an impact on equity. And then they translate that back to the line item level for their budget requests. And it was one request after the other in the city of Denver. It started with snow removal in their public works department. They looked at the impound lot and were actually addressing on the other side of the equation the revenue, certain revenues that were inequitable based on affordability, and where people were losing their vehicles and not even being able to afford getting them out of the impound lot. Denver's looking at foregoing those particular revenues, which came forward as a budget recommendation. But again, point being, the transition from line item based discussions and recommendations over to the program level has unlocked in the budget process the opportunity to get far better budget requests that are coming forward. In our own tools, so our technical approach to incorporating this into design. So for any of you who are familiar with our tools and our budget development work, we are baking in program inventory examples so that departments begin with this data. So this is our recommendation to all of you as well. So I'm showing right now that as a library department is going through and trying to conceive of what are the programs that they're going to use in the budget process. We're bringing to bear all other libraries that we've seen to help that department get their program inventory started. And then later in the budget development process, again, from a technical perspective, that you can center budget requests at the program level. You can still do line item level budget requests. So if you have a general need to increase electricity or office supplies, you can still submit a line item based budget request overall in the budget process. But it's this opening of the door that requests can be submitted at a program level that is now driving the discussion. What are you trying to do to snow removal that puts it more in line with equity? In our budget development efforts overall as well, what we're showing you, and some of you might be able to design this into your own portals, but if you don't have this, this is what we're building right now. Identifying, is it a personnel request? Is it a non-personnel request within the program? Is it both? What is the nature of the program change? So if I was talking about increasing snow removal for residential sidewalks, I would indicate it's an increased service level type of recommendation. What is its impact on equity? I can begin to flag that impact overall. And clearly, this is something that we're going to go into a lot more detail on December 7th in the ICMA presentation. But then I open up my access to the line items again to make that connection, because again, we need it for the budget to say, what are my personnel impacts? What are my non-personnel impacts? And what is the overall nature of the budget recommendation that I'm about to submit? So I just wanted you to see that, to move from conceptual, yeah, I get it, we're moving from line items and snow removal to the actual program. But our overall technical point is we really need to bake that into the budget development process, that requests are taking place at a program level. The second component, and back to Ben Noble's point overall, is that if at all possible, we need to be involved with the departments to strategize early and collaboratively with the departments as their partner as budget requests are being conceived. And that is just such an interesting point, because I think that for probably all of you listening on the call, if you're from the budget office, or if you're from the manager's office, or even an equity department, maybe this is new territory to actually be working or consulting with the departments as they are developing their budget requests. In the City Budgeting for Equity and Recovery program, Bloomberg's program, one of our client cities was the city of Tacoma, Washington. Again, they felt that they had established a very clear definition for their equity objective with many measurable components, as you see here on the screen overall. But just like Denver, just like Ben's experiencing in Seattle, as requests are coming in, that's where the disconnect was being felt once again. And so with Tacoma, we actually took all of the budget requests and we went back to the drawing board, back to work with the departments, taking a look at their requests and actually asking far more specific questions in what we called an appreciative inquiry exercise, to say, department, here is your budget request overall. We see that you're asking for $150,000 from a special revenue fund, and it's for one thing or the other, in this case, mitigating impacts of encampments on private property and a pilot program. So the idea was, how can we get back into the specific request and ask equity related questions that are customized based on your specific definition, so that we have a way better understanding of the proposals that do have some that can move the needle on our equity objective versus those budget proposals that actually don't. So this is not splitting the atom to ask additional questions on a budget request. Most all of you in a business case process, I'm sure, or in your operating or capital budget request forms, ask some additional follow-up questions. But what I'm talking about is one step further, not being passive and saying, here's our form, please fill it out. But we actually worked with the departments for every single budget request to say, how specifically will this improve on our definition for equity? And that engagement with departments actually led to departments having a far better appreciation for what the result was all about and how it's being measured, and fine-tuned many of their budget proposals, and led to some budget proposals being thrown off the table, that these really don't have anything to do with the equity objective overall. So City of Tacoma, Washington, they've done a fantastic job. Again, from a technical perspective and our tools, we have baked in the the need to ask more specific clarifying questions, whether it's from equity perspective or climate. If it's a personnel related question tied to equity or non-personnel, these are customizable questions in the budget development process that we're trying to bring to bear to make sure that the budget development process is yielding the best possible proposals overall. So moving into the second section, that was better budget development requests. Our hope at this point is that you now have some tactics to be working with the departments, at least appreciating, hey, if we can have program specific budget requests, that's going to get more snow removal or impound lot type of recommendations on the table versus stretch case recommendations that are around office supplies and have some weak connection to our equity result. And also that second point was actually getting, roll up your sleeves and work with the departments to push on their budget development requests, ask specific questions, and really make sure, are these in line with equity or are they not, early on in the conception of their budget proposals as they're coming into development. If you can do those two things, you're well on your way. The second area we wanted to focus on from a practical perspective, again, this sounds so easy, but clear criteria for equity. I'll start with the obvious. The more that we can get equity definitions that are very plain and simple to understand and preferably measurable, then it's going to really help our departments to craft budget proposals that are in line with that particular result. In the city budgeting for equity and recovery effort, we had communities like Seattle that are years in progress towards a very clear definition and measurements. Austin, Texas is another that has been on this path for a very long time. And then there are others in the program who were developing a definition of equity for the very first time. And so it's just recognizing that for all of you on the call, maybe you have an equity definition, maybe you have a disparities report like Roanoke, Virginia. Maybe you have an understanding of where vehicle ownership is low, like Denver, Colorado, or maybe you're like Columbia, South Carolina, who was developing a definition of equity for the first time this year. One of our partners in the program, Dr. Anjali Shanani, wrote a spectacular and simple article about this in Route 50. And you can Google this, but to budget for equity, cities must first define equity. She's going to share in that article many of the same findings that I'm just about to get into. So it's an awesome article. If you want to copy it and provide it to some of your elected officials, it's a tremendous reference. So I showed you Denver's. So this is their very simple, easy to understand outcome. And then below this, if you drill down, they are trying to address what does it mean that your life outcomes can be predicted by the race or ethnicity of your residents overall. That's where they're trying to justify what does the data say about this. But we loved that this is such a simple and easy to grasp definition. For any of you in the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, I think it's GARE, is an ICMA partner. They have a very similar definition that they're using overall and is something that many cities are adopting. In Columbia, South Carolina, as I mentioned, this is their very first definition as well. And they were starting to anticipate, not only can we get a very clear, plain English way to understand the equity definition, but also how would we start to envision how we're going to measure this? And they thought about equity from a process standpoint. So in their employment processes, in their budgeting processes, do they have equity, as well as overall equity for residents in the city of Columbia, South Carolina? So again, really great starting place. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, they have spent a lot of time on understanding, defining equity and measuring it. So they have their for overall indicators of equity, health, food, and safety, education, workforce development, and entrepreneurship, and so on. And for any of those 4 domains, they have 80 additional indicators that they are trying to understand how those indicators are being met or not met for various segments of their population throughout the city. And then they go one step further. For any indicator, what is the direction that we're headed overall? And they're even linking this back to some of their program data. So I wanted to start from very high level and easy, like the city of Denver's, to city of Columbia, which is for the very first time, hey, we really need to get started, to where you can go with it, like you're seeing here for the city of Pittsburgh. All 3 of those examples, this information, like the equity indicators in Pittsburgh, is on the city's website. So always want to make sure that you're pointed to some free resources overall so you can see how they're going after it. But with this clarity, this is providing departments with something very clear to aim for with their budget proposal. So back to the Tacoma story, they wouldn't have been able to have the meetings with departments about their budget proposals to push back on them if they didn't have clarity around their equity definition. So those first 2 points really work together. And to follow up on that, for clear criteria for equity, being able to now evaluate budget requests that are coming in somewhat of an quantitative or analytical framework. So we use a scoring rubric to differentiate and prioritize among proposals. And this can be a way to create an equal playing field for all departments as they are submitting their budget requests overall. So City of Austin, Texas worked with us in the city budgeting for equity and recovery exercise. They actually used one department, which was really fascinating, to test pilot a scoring rubric. And that was their within their arts and culture programs, where many of these were felt to have a substantial impact on equity in Austin for equitable access to entrepreneurs and artists. But during the part of the pandemic last year, when tourism really grinded to a halt, most of the programs in that department were supported by a hotel occupancy tax that fell about 91%. So all of these programs were fairly decimated. Now they're trying to get budget proposals back on the table, as well as what we'll get to in our third point, finding the resources to fund these programs overall. But throughout that course of work, we worked at the program level and we're identifying program change recommendations from a budget perspective that would increase equity, as well as starting to find the resources to fund them. And that's what this particular chart is demonstrating. I'm going to get into what we call an insight workshop, a program insight workshop, which is program change recommendations, which is a budget request. I'll get into that here in just a second. But in Austin's case, for all budget requests that were coming forward, they used a scoring rubric. They were trying to make it super simple to say, does this program, does this request support historically marginalized individuals? They were tying equity into some of their economic development objectives as well. So being within city planning, economic development, and arts and culture, does this create jobs? What about the source of funding? What about funding by race code and other particular demographics? So every budget proposal was systematically tagged for an overall prioritization that they could use as they're evaluating requests that were coming out of the department. I'd mentioned Pittsburgh. Their focus was on equity and climate, which are inextricably linked, to be sure. But this is a snapshot just from just over a month ago now, as they are reflecting on how budget proposals were developed at the program level tied to equity and climate. I'm pointing to one of the city planning's budget development requests tied to their overall objectives for a climate and energy manager position. Again, here I'm going to get a little bit technical to show you what we've baked into the tools. So this is at the program level. The program is environment, sustainability, and resiliency. we have some other facts about that program that we know. For any budget development requests, there could be multiple that exist for a particular program. So here's one for workforce training. Here's another for membership dues. It's tied back to the program overall. This particular request is for a climate and energy manager. We're getting some high-level flags or indicators from the department to say, just tell me, are you intending that this request is impacting our climate action plan? How does this request impact our equity indicators? We're going to get into the detail and ask you further scrutinizing question later, but just so we can sort it at the beginning, they're asking for these initial tags. Is it one time? Is it ongoing? And what is the nature of the program change? Which has always been interesting to differentiate between, is it some costs are going up because of general inflation, or is there a true service level increase that we're looking at? As the department goes through to submit their budget request, now I've indicated it's equity and climate related. I've given you my specific definition. I'm coming in and I'm adding my climate and energy manager to my other personnel who are assigned to this program. So our budget process is definitely linking all line item data back to the program perspective overall. But this way, we can see all of the budget requests versus what we are approving in terms of their alignment or lack thereof with the city's overall priorities. For those of you who have followed our work in priority-based budgeting, you'll know quartile 1, quartile 2, these Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. These are shorthand designations for highly aligned with results. Quartile 1, extremely relevant to what we're trying to achieve, our equity goals included, versus quartile 4, which might have very much less to do with the results we're trying to achieve. So this is a scoreboard that Pittsburgh would use as they're communicating back and forth with the departments. Here's what everything that you've requested, here's what we're starting to approve, like this climate and energy manager overall. And we can toggle to look at the impact on their climate objective or their equity objective. So this is the point. In the budget development process, we need a way to be able to analytically sift through those budget proposals that are attached to programs that have a climate or equity angle or intent to them, as opposed to line item based budget requests going all the way back to the beginning with some unknown tie to our equity objectives. We have to move somehow in this direction. And this is our approach, our practical approach to this solution. So really cool stuff out of Pittsburgh. Again, you can go on their website and see the budget requests that were coming forward, any specific budget requests, its impact on equity or climate, the type of program change, the detailed description, just like we showed for Tacoma, Washington. And the final punchline, this is just mayor's reflection, but they have baked this in by executive order into the very budget development process that all budget requests need to be evaluated using a climate and equity lens, which for them means we're going to score the program like we showed you for Austin relative to our overall results and be able to reflect those proposals that are in alignment with our outcomes and those that simply aren't. And that's how they're differentiating their budget requests and institutionalizing this as well. And I'll just say this, after coming out of the Bloomberg presentation about an hour ago, Mayor Benjamin from Columbia, South Carolina, he did not run for re-election. He might be termed out actually, but one of his biggest concerns is they have focused now for the last 2 years on equity in Columbia, South Carolina. This is the first time they've ever defined it. Everything over this last year has been wonderful, but he said that his number one fear throughout the process was what happens when he leaves and somebody else comes into office, and what do their priorities look like? But his biggest takeaway was by baking it into the DNA of the budget development process itself, baking in an equity lens, it creates the best chance, the highest probability that they could sustain their progress because now it's part of how budget requests are being developed. Is that forever? Not, who knows? But at least it's not just a one-time project. It's an evaluation criteria. It's a framework that is now integral to how budget requests are being developed and expressed and prioritized. Cool. So our last section here, I wanted to get into readily available resources. So the point here is that you can imagine departments playing ball. So they're paying attention. We understand there's a definition for equity. I work in this organization, and so I want to propose budget requests that are viewed positively through this lens. Maybe I've gone through the process of converting from line item based budget requests to program based, and all of that sounds great. But there does come this moment, and maybe many of you have been thinking about it, where you're wondering, from a department perspective, if I put something on the table to get funded for equity, does that mean that some other budget proposal that I really had on my mind is not going to get funded? So it's a one-to-one, a zero-sum game. And this is what we're trying to prevent. And for any of you who have followed our work, and this is at the heart of 21st century budgeting with ICMA, a skill set that we need is to expand our resources, really maximize readily available resources, so it's not perceived by a department as a losing prospect if they put something on the table for equity, but instead we can have our cake and eat it too, so to speak. And I'm going to get into this in just a second, but it's a suspicion that we have that maybe some of the reason that we don't see the best budget proposals coming from departments in line with our equity objectives is because if you put yourself in their shoes, if they put something on a table that's equity related and that gets funded, that's great. But what about all of the other priorities that they have for their department? How can we possibly balance between everything? And definitely a hard problem to solve, but we're really working on it. So part of our approach is to really focus on resource reallocation. How can we ensure throughout your organization that you are trying to free up some portion of your budget to have available to fund your equity initiatives? If I'm a department and we go through some exercise, some work to free up X amount of dollars, some multi-million-dollar pot, and that is for equity, and then in addition to that, I can participate in the regular budget development exercise, then maybe we're getting somewhere. We have continued to highlight since at least 2009, organizations who have been able to reallocate over 10% of their budget overall. So this is the story of Washington County, Wisconsin, and South Jordan, Utah, just like Plano, Texas, Shawnee, Kansas, Branson, Missouri, Kalamazoo, Michigan, and so on. We're not only saying this is exemplary, but we need to make this normal, that we're measuring and intentionally trying to free up resources, capture them so that we can allocate them towards something like equity. If we don't have the real resources to fund our equity initiatives, then you're not budgeting for equity. We're just saying that we really like equity, but we don't put our money where our mouth is. And that's what we're hoping to change. So our method to get there, which is part budget process, but it actually can be conducted at any time outside of the budget process, is what we call programmatic insights. And the whole idea behind insights is that we're going to take our programs and everything we know about them, and we're going to work specifically with departments to come up with opportunities to reallocate resources within and generate new resources, perhaps that you've never considered before, all for a purpose, all for a very specific goal. So if equity is your goal, we're going to try to drum up $10 million to fund our equity objectives. And for all of us who are going through ARPA right now, and even the upcoming infrastructure bill, I think we all recognize we have some amazing one-time opportunities today to use ARPA resources or the infrastructure bill to go after and pursue our equity goals or our climate goals, but they are one time. And so what happens when those resources are no longer here? That's the idea with insights, is how do we create sustainable, ongoing, long-term commitments towards programs or projects that are in line with our equity or climate goals. That's exactly where Pittsburgh was. We've worked with the city of Pittsburgh for the last year. When they first came to us, they had a wonderful climate action plan filled with budget proposals, filled with initiatives that they want to implement, each with a price tag. And yet last year, around this time, when it came to the budget adoption, by and large, their climate action plan was unfunded. And that's problematic. Again, it's what I just said about equity. If we say we're climate focused, but we actually don't have any budget to fund our climate action plan, then we're not climate focused. We have a great document of unfunded initiatives is what we have. So using the program and priority-based budgeting framework, Pittsburgh developed their business intelligence at a program level, shifting from line items to programs, program costs. And then we went through what I'm about to show you, a goal-oriented program insight exercise to generate resources to fund this climate action plan. And so their goal, as you see down here below, was 5% of their $250 million in operating costs that they had allocated to programs in their priority-based budgeting work. So they're hoping if we can drum up $12.5 million worth of opportunities to fund our climate action plan, then this will be a tremendous success. So working with all of their departments, they had 40 participants overall. They went through 3 days, a very focused multi-step program insight workshop. This is actually some screen captures from our old tools, but they will do the trick to show what things looked like just a few months ago. But these have even been improved. Departments were carouseled through different opportunity rooms where they were looking at everything that they offer, every program they offer, through a specific lens, again, with the overall intent that we need to free up $12.5 million to fund our climate action plan. So some departments would start with all of their programs and they're looking for program efficiencies. Other departments started at partnerships where they could leverage other program providers, looking for ways to become more efficient and free up resources overall. Some looked at new revenue ideas. Maybe we can look at entrepreneurial revenue generating concepts that would bring in new revenue if we were a regional providing partner of some sort. Other departments looked at service level decreases. What are programs we are providing right now, which maybe we can do less of and free up resources to fund our climate action plan, or do none at all. And then we still opened up one more window to say, maybe the climate action plan is short-sighted. Maybe there are yet more service level increases we should be focused on for our climate and equity goals. The point here being every department would scrutinize all of their programs through one specific lens, and then they would shift and look at the next lens, partnerships, and they would move to revenue generating. And from the technical perspective, we provided the tools to capture program insights at a very high level. What is the nature of this insight? Is it a partnership? Is it a service delivery change? How much could we conceivably save if we implemented this? Day one was meant to, at a very high level, maximize all possible ideas they could come up with. And they came up with 186 program specific insights from a program efficiency perspective, service level decrease, and so on and so forth. Day two, just like we showed with the scrutinizing questions for a budget proposal, we have the same infrastructure for the insight workshops because these are budget proposals, really just off budget. And in day two, they move from all of their possible crazy ideas to things that are more actionable and implementable, and with specific questions that are guided through some facilitation. They whittled down their list of 186 to 105. And then by day three, where they're actually presenting, we call them stump speeches, to their peer groups and actually getting some social feedback by way of voting, that large population was whittled down even further to about 98 insights in total. But the yield overall was $41 million. Remember, their initial goal was $12.5 million. $41 million composed of $23 million in resource reallocation opportunities and $18 million in new revenue generating opportunities. And here's Mayor Peduto talking about this. But here, the point being, for all, going back to big picture, for all of our talk on how do we implement budgeting for equity, if we don't get the budgeting part right, if we don't have the resources to fund equity, we're going to have an empty promise. And yet it's not, where do you go to find all of your extra resources to fund equity or fund climate? In Pittsburgh's case, we had to focus on a program insight workshop to drum up these new opportunities for resource reallocation and revenue generation to apply towards that goal. So hopefully you're seeing all of the pieces come together, better budget development requests, along with clear definition of equity, and ensuring that we have the resources finally available to dedicate to our objectives. The last section is totally my segue into December 7th with ICMA. But if we have the resources and we still are feeling like we need to prioritize, we still don't have enough. This is where I started. This is the best problem to have, is that you have too many awesome budget proposals and they're all in alignment with the results that you're trying to achieve. So how do we find balance if we still do not have all of the resources that we need? This is where we need to get into a prioritization framework, and that is what we're going to get into on next Tuesday. But hopefully this is giving you some practical food for thought on how we're trying to break the problem down overall. I know we do have just about 5 more minutes, but I would love to know if anybody has any questions. I'm looking at chat for the very first time, so if there were questions and I ignored them, I apologize. But like there, it looks like Liz tackled them for me, so thanks, Liz. Any questions about what you're trying to do from a budgeting for equity perspective, or some of the techniques that you saw today that you'd like a little bit more explanation or dig into them a little deeper? Well, I know it's also a lot of information, but we're working our way towards institutionalizing budgeting for equity, budgeting for ensuring we have resources for climate action. And these are the latest kind of great leaps that we are injecting into the budget process itself to make sure that we are going to come through on our commitments for equity, for climate, and for all of the priorities that we have overall. So welcome anybody to stay in touch with us and follow up. Oh, here we go from Eric. What was the composition of the groups of 8 in the last exercise? You know, I do have Eric Keck on the line, who I'd welcome to talk about his experiences in conducting program insight efforts. And, you know, Eric Hempel, we've done it where we have cross-departmental teams. I think Eric Keck is just writing that in the chat right now, where we're setting the framework. Here's the lens to look at to generate the types of program change recommendations. And then collaboratively with departments, we're simply facilitating their progress as EK is describing. Eric Keck, do you have anything that you would love to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I would just add to that it is the beauty of this whole process of engaging in insights is that it is cross-departmental. And for many of the organizations that we've had the opportunity to engage with, what we found is that it generates a richer discussion. It builds awareness, as well as it builds an understanding of more broadly about what the organization is trying to achieve together. And so this particular work, whether it's equity-based or even just an insight workshop to try to cure a budget imbalance, really does rely on the wisdom of the crowd. And so when you have participants who are empowered and open to being able to work together and challenge one another in a positive environment, then great ideas emanate from that. And then also a commitment comes from that to to create a successful future. And that's what's really neat about this proactive approach with dealing with insights.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks for asking the question, other Eric with a C. Cool. All right. Well, hey, thank you everyone for spending the last hour with us. We'll go ahead and bring this presentation to a close and send out the recording. Please feel free to stay in touch with us as you're reflecting on some of these techniques and thinking about how they could apply in your organization. I think our emails are in the recording that we send out, but just in case, resourcex.net, here's me. And I'll simply say thanks and bring this to a close. Take care, everyone, and good luck.